In most regards, Stephen F. Austin's funeral was like any other funeral. Friends and family of the person being buried come together, dressed in their best dark clothing. Their faces are long, their conversation quiet, out of respect for the occasion. Prayers are said, songs sung. A few people speak about the person's life and accomplishments, what his or her time on earth meant to them. If the deceased was a public figure, like Austin, some of these speakers are also prominent people: judges, politicians, generals. Ordinary people, most of whom never met the person being buried, gather outside. They watch as his body is taken to a cemetery and put into a grave, with family and close friends tossing handfuls of dirt on the coffin to mark their loved one's final departure. Newspapers describe the day's events, maybe reprinting the speeches given. The death and funeral become the subject of conversations for days and maybe weeks. Then they fade slowly into the past, perhaps to be remembered again on the anniversary of the person's death or birth, especially if they were important enough to have a holiday established in their honor. Think George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Jr. That is more or less what happened at Austin's funeral. He was the person who first brought large numbers of American colonists into what was then, in the 1820s, the Mexican province of Coahuila y Tejas. It wasn't easy. A few years before, his father, Moses Austin, had traveled to San Antonio and secured permission to bring American colonists into what was then a Spanish province. But Moses caught pneumonia on the return trip, dying shortly after returning to his Missouri home. Stephen, not even 30 years old, honored his father's dying wishes and resolved to bring colonists to Tejas. He went to Mexico City and persuaded the Congress of the newly independent nation of Mexico to honor the agreement between his father and the Spanish crown. In little more than a decade, something like 30,000 Americans moved to Texas. In 1836, joined by some of their Mexican neighbors, they rebelled against the Mexican government. After a crushing defeat at an old mission they knew as the Alamo, they managed to win their independence in the Battle of San Jacinto, not only defeating the Mexican army, but, astonishingly, capturing Mexico's president in the process. Austin served as the new nation's first Secretary of State, but only for a few months. He died in late December of 1836 at the age of 43. So, of course, his funeral was a huge event. His body was put on a horse-drawn wagon and carried to a nearby town. The town's leaders canceled school for the day, and the school children walked past the casket holding Austin's body, each one dropping a white flower on the casket as they passed, until the casket was covered with flowers. A prominent doctor addressed the gathered crowd of children and their families. He compared Stephen Austin to the biblical figure Moses, noting that he was only allowed a glimpse of the promised land to which he had led his people. Austin's body was then taken to the next town down the line, where a similar ceremony was conducted, with school children once again dropping flowers, this time roses.